It's 1933, and Germany has just elected a new chancellor from the National Socialist German Workers' Party, also known as the Nazi Party, named Adolf Hitler. Although the process was ugly, violent, and everything else in between, it was done. And it would only be less than a year later in 1934 before he and his party would eradicate all political competition in order to become Germany's absolute ruler in the form of the Führer. A decade earlier, in 1922, a former Italian sharpshooter named Benito Mussolini had the Italian government by the throat after leading a march of 40,000 fascists to the capital of Rome in demand of reign over the country. This event, in conjunction with fascist military squads that Mussolini had organized and prepared all throughout the country, created a situation in which Italy was in no place to deny him any of his demands, thus appointing him as the youngest prime minister and eventually dictator in Italy's history. Although his ascension was not as violent as the other two, the crowning of Hirohito as the Emperor of Japan in 1926 brought with it a good share of bloodshed in the form of Japan's invasions of China, the Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, etc. Due to a lack of natural resources in Japan's mainland, all throughout the early 20th century and up until the end of the war, Japan's empire under Emperor Hirohito was extremely motivated to expand their territories and influence over as much of Asia as they possibly could, disregarding the damages it would cause. The two European dictators, Hitler and Mussolini, would join forces in the Berlin-Rome Axis of 1937, an alliance which would soon become the Axis powers after the inclusion of Emperor Hirohito of Japan. Together, these rulers would lead their nations into the largest scale and bloodiest conflict humanity has ever seen, the Second World War. 20 million soldiers and 40 million civilian deaths later, we can't help but ask, what would have happened if these three men hadn't been given the chance to live? The First World War, known as the Great War, was, until that point, the largest scale military conflict that the world had seen. The conflict was between countries like France, England, Russia, and the US in the Allied powers, with Austro-Hungary, Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and of course Germany in the Central Powers. When this war first began in 1914, a 25-year-old Adolf Hitler would evade military conscription from his home in Austria to instead enlist in Germany's Bavarian army. Although he wasn't a German citizen, the authorities in place designated to avoid enlisting foreigners basically forgot to check Adolf's identification and therefore allowed him into the army. Hitler served in the 16th Infantry Reserve Regiment, where he would endure many battles, among them the First Battle of Ypres. Fought in the northern Belgian town, this conflict produced between 50,000 to 80,000 French casualties, 80,000 British and Belgian casualties, as well as another 80,000 German casualties on the enemy side. Adolf was a part of this conflict, and he could have easily been part of the 80,000 were it not for a decision of a soldier who was meant to kill him. Henry Tandey was the most decorated private in the First World War, and he was, according to Hitler, the man who was, quote, so near to killing me that I thought I should never see Germany again, end quote. Wounded in the leg from shrapnel, Hitler hobbled through the scorned battlefield in retreat when he stumbled into the aim of Tandey. From his perspective, Henry, quote, took aim but couldn't shoot a wounded man, letting who we assume today to be Hitler to escape. What would have changed if Tandey pulled the trigger that day? How would both our lives and the landscape of the world be altered today if this was more than just a hypothetical? Although there is evidence to suggest that Henry Tandey was not the soldier who spared Hitler's life, the truth is that someone had, and if that soldier's finger had tugged on the trigger just a little bit harder, we might have been living in a completely different world today. Anteo Zamboni was born in Bologna on the 11th of April of 1911. Much about him is unknown, especially what drove him to try assassinating one of the world's most powerful and ruthless dictators. Just half a year from his birthday, the 15-year-old Zamboni fired a single shot at Mussolini during one of his parades, missing the dictator and immediately being swarmed by the angry bystanders before he could shoot again. Anteo Zamboni, his father, and his aunt were all killed and made examples as to what rebellion entailed under Mussolini's government. Just a couple months earlier, Mussolini was subjected to yet another attempt on his life, this time by Irish woman Violet Albina Gibson, who, at the age of 50, ambushed Mussolini on yet another one of his parades and shot him. Unlike Anteo, she would clip Mussolini on the nose, but her gun would misfire on the attempted second shot. Unlike Anteo again, she was not killed by the angry crowd due to Mussolini's request of having her arrested and deported instead. Upon interrogation after her capture, Gibson stated calmly that she had attempted to assassinate Mussolini to, quote, glorify God, and that the deity itself had, quote, kindly sent an angel to steady her aim. The assassination attempts would propel Italy's dictator into new levels of fame and perceived omnipotence. After having survived several attempts on his life, he was hailed by many as no less than a god. If these attempts had succeeded, however, Italy's invasions and massacres throughout Africa would have likely never happened. The Axis powers would be severely lacking manpower in Europe, and, as is the theme of this video, the world we live in would be absolutely unrecognizable. Emperor Showa, more commonly known as Hirohito, was the 124th Japanese emperor and had been in power since 1926 upon the death of his father and now the late emperor Yoshihito. 16 years before his coronation, Korea had finally been annexed in 1910 by Japan after years of conflict and was experiencing the devastating effects of the colonial rule. Schools, newspapers, textbooks, and whatever else had any chance of educating the people of South Korea were meticulously scanned and, if deemed dangerous to Japanese rule, were burnt without hesitation. From what we know today, this was applied to around 200,000 scripts, historical writings, and Korean documents, which was essentially a cultural genocide. Similarly, all of the Korean language was made illegal. Korean land, infrastructure, and historical monuments were modified and destroyed in whichever way the Japanese saw fit, and around 725,000 Korean workers were forced to work in Japan and its colonies. It's needless to say that this abuse, coupled with countless other offenses, generally pissed off the Korean populace. One of these people coincidentally being Korean independence activist Lee Bong-chang. Being born around the year 1900, Lee was a Korean who basically grew up with all of the aforementioned restrictions on Korean culture and history, and thus grew up as what many called the generation of quote, new Japanese. This generation, born under Japanese rule, saw themselves as Korean-born Japanese, even if they shared zero ancestry. Being part of the generation, Lee learned Japanese and even adopted a Japanese name in the hopes of passing as a natural-born Japanese person, yet was completely turned away by the people who had colonized his country. After being detained for having a letter in Korean in his pocket, and also being publicly shunned for not speaking Japanese fluently, Lee decided to join the Korean independence movement. Supported by this organization seeking independence, Lee was given 2 modified hand grenades in order to take out the emperor who would be parading through Shinjuku, Tokyo. In the event itself, Lee struggled but managed to make it to what appeared to be the emperor's carriage, throwing a grenade at it only to have it weakly detonate and barely scratch the carriage. On top of this, the carriage at which Lee threw the grenade contained a member of the emperor's entourage and not the emperor himself. Lee was swiftly arrested, judged, sentenced, and executed for the attempted murder of the Japanese emperor, his attempt forever known in Korean history as, quote, the patriotic deed of Lee Bong-chang. Henry Tandey, Anteo Zamboni, Violet Gibson, and Lee Bong-chang are the names of not individuals, but of the manifestation of revolution, courage, and change. Almost all of the world's rulers have been target of several assassinations, and these world leaders aren't any different. Although these are only but a few instances of which Hitler, Mussolini, and Hirohito could have lost their lives, I believe that the timeframes in which these 4 assassination attempts occurred present the incredible hypothetical situation of a world without the figureheads responsible for the worst human conflict of all time. If these assassinations had been successful, if these people had died on these dates, we would most likely speak of them as heroes, but instead, they are the people who almost prevented World War II.